Hello everyone, this is Mini Ninjas. This particular video is going to be a bit of a follow-up to the previous Demoniacal Fit Chosen Ones review video, in that I'm going to take the opportunity now that I had the chance to reshoot some footage and pick up a few things from the comments of the previous one to answer a few questions that I kind of overlooked in my original review here. So what that means is we're going to do a proper review of the articulation points, talk about how well the hands and heads move on both this and the real one, how interchangeable they are, and also some talking about the energy ball, which turned out to be a bit of an issue that other reviews did point out. So starting off with the whole articulation bit, you pretty much are getting here what you expect out of the current 2.0 action body poses, meaning that the shoulders themselves are currently working on kind of butterfly joints. You have double hinged elbows in this case. Everything is working just fine. Everything's good and tight. You have the wrists themselves are on ball joints. The upper torso rotates and has an ab crunch on there just fine. Disregard the head falling off here. I just didn't put it properly on when I was doing some head switching off camera. As we're about to see when I turn the whole thing upside down, it does stay in there fine. Admittedly, when I messed around with the drill, I made it a bit looser than what I would have planned on, but hey, as long as it works. As you can see, the legs here are indeed using the 2.0 action body things, meaning that you get a pretty good range of kick in front. If not a little better than the real one, I'd say, just because the skirt is a little softer than the real version in this case, and you get some pretty decent range back. And of course, you get your side kicks working just perfectly fine on this one. Everything moves as it's supposed to. It's still a very fluid motion, not as tight as the original figure, but mind you, mine was too tight if anything. Moving on to the knees, of course, you got your double jointed knee. Everything works as it's supposed to, and as you can see, everything in terms of the joint structure appears as it should. So everything is pretty much what you expect out of the real figure, including the ankles here, which, much like on the original figure, I had to actually manually pull out slightly in order to get things to bend properly, because otherwise the figure was standing incredibly poorly. And in case you're wondering, yes, the boot legs are the boot cuffs are slightly off color compared to the shoes, but that's because the shoes themselves are unpainted, which is the exact same issue I had with the real figure. So that's a little bit of odd accuracy. I'm probably repeating myself. That still applies here. Now, moving on to the faces in here, we're going to take a look at some of the faces getting put on there. I didn't exactly cover this in the original review, but as it did come up in the comments, let's take a quick look. Switching from this rigging face to a bit more of a neutral face. As you can see, it's very competently done. It's actually, I'd say this version of the neutral face is better than what I have on my real one. The eyes look a little weird on my real version, but generally speaking, everything's just fine. We, of course, have a yelling face for this rosé head here. It's just as comparable to the real one. In fact, I kind of mixed them up in my original review in between footage until I noticed the earrings were slightly different in color, which is probably the best way to tell the Chosen Ones version from the real version here. So now we're going to switch off to the neutral head, which is the one the figure originally comes with when you have it in the box. Everything just pops on really well. I'd say this head pops on better in this case because that's the one that's originally on there. I had to mess around with the rosy head to get it to fit, as I mentioned earlier and showed a little bit of in the previous video. So we're going to put this slight smirk on this case, which is one of the original faces that came with one of the normal faces came with the first figure. And as you can kind of see, it's competently done. There's nothing that particularly stands out about it, so that's perfectly fine. And we're going to look at kind of the grimacing face in a second, once I remove the original face here. And much like the original figure, it's competently done. There's nothing that stands out or as being odd on here. And in the case of this one, I'd say the mouth outline is a little darker than what is on the real one, which actually makes it appear a little better, at least in my opinion. As you can see, perfectly competently done. There's nothing odd about that. Now, what I didn't include in my original footage, but I mentioned kind of verbally, is that the way the faces were set up, you can indeed interchange between the real and the bootleg heads and the real heads. But what I should mention here, and you're now seeing a little bit in visual here, is that the pegs on the Chosen Ones faces are a bit shorter than the real ones, so they won't stick in normally or just on their own. But once you get the hair in place, it stays on there just fine. And same thing kind of for the normal faces in this case. The one I have in my hand there is, I believe, the bootleg head. That's the problem. It's actually really hard to tell in this footage. But the gist of it is the faces are interchangeable vice versa between the two figures. So realistically, if you did want to pick up the Chosen Ones in order to just use the faces on the new figure, particularly the new smirking face for some reason, then technically yes, that is a thing you can do. And speaking of interchangeable, the figure on hand right there is the real one, just for notice. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to be checking to see if you can indeed put the chosen one's hands on the real figure, because that is something I did mention in the previous one, because the pegs were about the same size. And while it is a bit of a snug fit, I would say, I can definitely say yes, you can fit it on there. It takes a little bit of work. You might want to, in this case, heat up the hands a little bit before you put it on there, just so it's a bit of a smoother fit. As you can see, I am struggling a little bit on there, but it does fit on there, and you are able to safely remove it. You might want to actually heat it up, as I was just saying, but generally speaking, you're perfectly fine. So yes, you can put the open or the gripping hands on the real figure, and thus use the scythe on your real Goku Black figure. Which actually might be what I'm doing for my display case, is I'm going to keep both of them display, one of them as normal and one of them as the rosé. So this might be how I handle it. As you can see, it looks pretty much fine there. I could push the peg of the ball joint in the hand a little more, but it's functional enough. Now here's kind of the issue that I didn't address because I completely glazed over on, and I learned this in another review actually, from D-Star I believe. There's actually a bit of an issue in terms of how the ball point or the energy ball has been handled in the bootleg here, which is probably the only serious glaring flaw that I was able to find, namely that it hasn't been casted properly. Now while the exact amount of peg issues kind of seem to vary from one figure to the next based on some of the reviews I've seen up to this point, just to give you an idea of the general issue I've been seeing pop up, it's namely that because the ball itself has been cast in a way that makes it slightly distorted, you're going to have cases where kind of parts of the anchoring points of the pegs are slightly off kilter on the actual energy effect itself, and while the actual beams themselves seem to be casted correctly, because the ball itself is a part that's flawed, they're not going to be fitting in correctly. So what I did in order to fix it in my case for the one single peg that I had an issue with is I actually took a diamond file, which you just saw me in hand with a second ago, and I slowly used an edge of it to kind of both expand the anchor point on the ball itself in order to kind of give us a little more wiggle room into the work with, as well as to slightly sand the actual edge of the remaining energy beam itself in order to get them to eventually fit in place. It took me like a minute or two in order to fix it out, and at this point now everything is fitting as it should and staying in place, which is the important part. In terms of how the actual energy effect fits in hand, because the ball itself is slightly off kilter, one or so of the fingers don't fit perfectly on there, but it still does a fairly reasonable enough job. That's what you're going to have to use the other hand for in order to use it for the support, but that's kind of part for the course. Even with the original one, I have issues getting the hand to fit in there properly. All in all, this is probably the biggest issue I've had with the figure thus far, and even then that's still not bad considering just how much cheaper this particular clone version of the figure is than trying to buy a legitimate copy of the original Bandai version in this case, which even in the SEC recolor, you're still looking at least $100. So can I still recommend the figure? Yes, easily. This is definitely a much cheaper version to get of Goku Black for your collection if you missed out the first time.